In the late 70s, Peter and I were working in Bethnal Green on a Greater London Arts Fellowship to run film and video workshops for the community. And when we were there, and I should say that this came out of a situation where we were looking for ways that we could use our work that would make a difference in social terms. And while we were doing the workshops, we were approached by a member of the Trades Council, Dan Jones, who was part of a campaign to help keep the local hospital open, Bethnal Green Hospital. And the situation was that this was the first wave of cuts in the health service by a then Labour government, in fact. And they were cutting all the small hospitals so that people would have to go to the large teaching hospitals like the London. And they were involved in the campaign and saw that we were working in the area and asked if we could do one of our workshops in the hospital because that would give them a campaign video. We didn't understand at the time, I think, the difference between doing a campaign video and a workshop. And so it was a real learning experience because we started to work with some people there. But in a workshop, you actually have to have a chance to make mistakes and, you know, it's a learning process. And so it was an issue, and it was a learning curve for us because we discovered in the end that it was going to be much better for us to work collaboratively with the campaign committee rather than in a participatory way. Although I should say that both of us have come back to work in a participatory way since, but very much informed by what happened there. So we did produce the video and we edited it out of camera shake and that was okay. But so when the committee saw that we were involved and we were there at all the marches and taking photos, they then asked us if we'd do some posters. Which were for fly posting, and we designed the posters, they paid for the printing, and we began to feel that this was a way that as artists who are looking for a way to bring about social change, that it was much better to be working with people who really knew the issues, and we have both carried on since then doing that. Keeping our role as artists, but actually not assuming that we know everything. And so the collaboration is all important. So we did the posters, and from there, there was some money left over from the campaign. Now I should say that the traditions on the left are very much, campaigning traditions on the left are very much literary traditions. So people write, they send out broadsheets historically, and it's still very much like that, you know, things are done through leaflets, etc. But we knew as artists the power that the visual can bring. And we also knew historically how art has conferred power onto people. And so we found that this was a way that we could confer that power through the image and through art production onto the people and the issues that mattered to us.
One of the other things that we did as well is that we created exhibitions from all the documentary material, and we took those exhibitions to other hospitals that went into occupation because the Middlesex Hospital and the Elizabeth Gareth Anderson Hospital went into occupation at the same time as the Bethnal Green Hospital campaign. And a lot of people don't realise, but what actually happened in Bethnal Green is that the staff took over the hospital, pushed the management out. They had patients referred through the ambulance service into the hospital, so the hospital couldn't be closed, and the staff ran the hospital. They occupied it. And that happened with the Elizabeth Gareth Anderson and the Middlesex. And what we did is we took exhibitions around to those hospitals, and some of those exhibitions contained things like tips. What happens before they close a hospital? They start to run the services down, like the lifts, the maintenance of various activities. The woman in the laundry actually pointed this out. She was the one who spotted that they were running the laundry down and questioned that and found out they were going to close the hospital. So it was all these tips about for other hospitals to say, okay, this is how it starts, watch out. The other important thing I think for us as well is that the transition from, because while we were making posters, we'd realised that the transition from just using image and text, as we had done previously, when the text included in the imagery, it's much more powerful. And that made us look around at, other artists and so on, and we'll come back to that later. But so the use of image and text, the use of exhibitions to inform other people, and the use of a steering group from the hospital staff that we worked with. Those are three key things that we then took on to subsequent projects that we worked on.
When there was some funding left over, some money left over from the campaign, and rather than put it into written material, the campaign committee asked us, and particularly it was this particular social worker and artist, I should say, Dan Jones, who thought that perhaps we could work with them in the work they wanted to do to inform people about the cuts more widely and how they were affecting people. And so they set up the East London Health Project. Now that was, again, something that we learned a lot from, because I think probably I can speak for myself, and I'm sure it's the same for Peter, that most of my learning has come from working with people, activists and other people in the field. And so this way of working was that they set up a steering group, and on the steering group were members of the health unions, NALGO and UP. There was the Tower Hamlets Health Campaign, and I think that was it, and ourselves, a trades council and ourselves. And the idea was that they knew the issues, we knew how to represent them, and so we would brainstorm together how to get that information out. Now, other artists used to say to us, well, isn't it like designed by committee? Because isn't it just like the lowest common denominator? In fact, it was completely opposite to that, because everyone was pooling their expertise, as people of course do in other fields of work. And they weren't telling us what the images should look like, and we weren't telling them what the issues were. And so together we were able to do something much better than either of us could do on our own. And I should say that we didn't actually decide on the posters, which in fact we called visual pamphlets at the time, because in fact we also brainstormed how best to get that information out, whether to use video. Tape slide was a medium that was used a lot then, but those required people sitting down and watching something. Pre-digital, people aren't going to look at it on their phones, so this required a gathering, and decided as a group that this was going to be more accessible if it was something that people could see. We weren't looking at fly posting on the streets this time. This was more about images that would be put in doctors' waiting rooms and in surgeries and whatever, so that where people were sitting and had a bit more time to think about it. It was so valuable being able to work in that way and being invited by the Trades Council to do that, because we had started on the Bethnal Green Hospital campaign with what I would describe as the bottom of the agenda syndrome. So when they were doing that campaign and we'd been asked to do a video, there was a public meeting, and right at the end, under any other business, when everyone's getting up to leave, they're saying these couple of artists are going to do a video. Well, I mean, nobody thinks that artists are going to have any effect on anything. And we sort of proved our worth. I think that's what happened. And so by the time it came to them wanting to put resources into something that really mattered, they actually recognised that art had a role to play. And that was something that mattered a lot to us.
Other useful things about the East London Health Project really was the consolidation of that idea of working with a group much more intimately. And we were no longer bottom of the agenda. We were being seen as important, playing an important role. So therefore, the the dialogue was much better. It was much more of a dialogue of equals, and in terms of how it affected our visual practice as well. They talked about, instead of just cheap posters that were going to go on the streets, they were talking about good, high quality posters that would go in waiting rooms and various places indoors, where they could be looked at and explored over time, so that people would have a longer time to look at it. So we could think about reading distances as well, so that they would have a reading distance from a distance and captions to kind of draw people in, and then it would have smaller text to then explain the issues in a lot more depth. So that whole thing about reading distances was another thing that we then took into our practice later on as well. But at the time it was, all important learning curve.
It's also true that we moved to we had less and less text and more image. We discovered you could say far more in an image. So when we'd started the work for Bethnal Green, they were very text heavy. That exhibition was very text heavy.
Yeah.
As we moved into the East London Health Project, we started to reduce the text more and more. By the time we came into our later work in the Docklands, we were able to produce images that were probably only had a caption and perhaps one or two other lines of text where necessary. So yes, it did help to develop us as artists at the same time.
And the reading distance thing, when we were using billboards, of course, was crucial. And then exploring that in a time-based way as well was something that we'd learned from the East London Health Project, but we took it in a slightly different direction in Docklands too. We both started off with a fine art background, let's say, and we were working across media in different directions. The influences, so broad influences within the fine art arena, but particular influences at the time were in the university. Stuart Brisley and Mark Shamovitz influenced from a performative point of view, but particularly Stuart Brisley dealing with social issues. Mark Shamovitz to some extent, but Stuart Brisley probably more so. And Carol Ann Tisdale, who was our art history teacher, of course, was the seminal person who was writing about Joseph Beuys at the time, and she got us involved in the Free University and all of that. And we went to Documenta 6 in Castle and were part of the Joseph Beuys workshop there. We had, of course, seen the exhibition at the ICA, which included Joseph Beuys and Klaus Steck and many others. And artists like Stuart Brisley were kind of taking part in the conference too at the time. He did walk out at one point, but that's another story. That's immediate. Then looking back into history, oppositional art during the Renaissance and far back in history, it's disappeared. Nobody knows about it because, the winners write history, the winners preserve their art. But in the 20th century, people from the Russian Revolution, Rodchenko in particular, was one influence. John Harfield, of course, when we were dealing with photography and the relationship between image and text. He was obviously a very key person that we looked at the time. But just in terms of thinking about composition and all of those issues, I think my kind of earlier background as a painter, I was influenced with composition and colour, which kind of took a slight a black burner in a sense with the earlier stuff, because we were dealing mainly in black and white, but then adding colour in very specific ways. And then in the East London Health Project, where we were actually doing colour photography, etc., that became an important factor for me as well.
I think going back into history, as you mentioned the Renaissance, well, I was really interested in the fact that, as artists, not many artists were working the way that we were doing at the time. There were some, but it wasn't the norm, and we got a lot of flack from the art world, or were ignored or whatever. But having studied the Italian Renaissance, you know, it seemed to me that artists even then were working as teams on social issues, you know, so even if it was for church and state, they were working in public. And so the concept of the individual artist, you know, creating a saleable commodity, actually developed with the rise of capitalism. The development of new technologies of canvas, for example, which made canvases portable, but also it was about the creation of the market. Well, if you look at the way art has been used throughout the world, throughout civilization, across the world, then actually the notion of the artist as an individual working on their own on issues of individual expression is less than 500 years in the West. And so we felt that we actually had a wider context. And then drawing on some of the examples that Peter's mentioned, we just looked in art history to find examples, and you will see the influences of the Rodchenko in the Bethnal Green exhibition. But in terms of our contemporaries, I would say that we were very influenced by people who were just a little bit older than us, Conrad Atkinson and Margaret Harrison. Yeah. Conrad was in the Art for Whom exhibition at the Serpentine, where we met, and have continued to be sort of mentors, I would say. And also Carol Condé and Carl Beveridge in Toronto. They were, in fact, Carol came over just after, we hadn't met them at that time, but they came over just after when we were doing the first work for the Docklands Community Poster Project. But those contacts have continued and sustained us, I think, because, as I say, there wasn't a big group of us. And so the fact that there are other people who were working perhaps in slightly different ways, but overlapping ways, and were politically committed and felt that they could change. And I would say that in terms of the social, the way society was then, you know, it was very much more divided than it is now, and it was a sort of a sense of, or that perhaps not now than it has been in intervening years. There was a sense you were either with them or against them, and therefore there was a sense that young people felt that if we only joined together enough that we could change the world. And I think we all had, those of us working in that way, had a conviction that that's what we could do, and I'm still trying to do it. I'm sure Peter is. So yes, that was, I suppose, the zeitgeist in a way within which we were working.
Yeah, Ken Saro-Wiwa says famously, "Before I am an artist, I am a citizen," and he died, you know, working in that way against the might of the oil companies, etc. But you know, that belief that as an artist you have a right to, you know, you should be working with the social fabric around you, and that work comes out of that. And if there are issues which are threatening the people that are around you, then you have a responsibility too. So that's very important. And that was very much a feel of the time too.
I think also, I have to mention the rise of feminism at the time, because you know, looking back at the videotape, I realised how much we were up against at the time, because at the time that seemed fine, and now I realise that, you know, how male-dominated everything was. And so yes, it isn't a coincidence that feminism needed to come to the fore, and it did give strength to all of us, I think, because of a belief in equality. In fact, I think all the work is really holds to the tenets of feminism, not just about equality, but in terms of sort of recognition of different voices and values. And yes, so I think that was really coming through, not necessarily in the content of the work, although I did work with the Women's Health Information Collective on the women's posters, but that I think has continued to influence our practice.
and the influence as well of the rise of the black art movement as well, which was only very much in its infancy then. The Thin Black Line was the first major exhibition of that work, and you know, all that was all happening at the same time. So it was a time as well when you had to take sides, as Lorainne said. You know, we were shifting from a situation where the Callaghan government was under attack from the IMF and the World Bank, etc. There'd been a run on the pound that caused the winter of discontent because it put the government in opposition to the Labour movement, and then the Thatcher government coming in, etc. So it was a time when you had to stand up and be counted.
I suppose that we learnt from the health work the importance of collaboration, which I've said before was like a pooling of expertise, and it also felt that that was the process that enabled us to make a difference as artists. That it would be arrogant as an artist, I think, to just assume that you know everything and therefore you make the work and you're making the statements. If there is an issue out there in society, there are likely to be people who are already addressing it, and they're probably going to be addressing it with much more closeness or expertise than you have yourself. And so that's how it's possible as an artist then to make a difference, I think, is that so all my work, all our work, I think, since then has been about how you develop that that sort of collaboration. And later on, as I mentioned, coming back to the notion of participation, because I think now I would see people who might be described as participants because they're where there is one artist in a larger group. But for me, all participants are also collaborators. So when, for example, I've worked with children on a project, I've worked with very young children because of the value of their imaginations, the power of their imaginations that I don't have. I've worked with teenagers who know what it's like to live in a city, and it's their experience of that. I don't have that experience. So I can work as I would say, I sort of frame a process through which their voice can come. And I think that started through this health work, that we were in a way allowing the voice of the campaigners to come through in the most powerful way we could discover.
Yes, and I think when people are talking about an issue which deeply concerns them, they talk with a passion, and that passion quite often delivers metaphors, powerful metaphors, and that's the fuel really for creating images, the metaphors. So that's something that we draw upon quite a lot. The other thing about that as well is that Lorainne talked about creating the framework through which things come. It's important to develop that framework for a number of reasons. One, for the reason I just said, but importantly, the framework allows a greater in-depth development of an idea. If it needs to have any depth, it has to go through a process of exploration and trying out different things. And so in a workshop, that's what you do with people. You take them in depth through that process, so that all those kind of the metaphors, the in-depth feelings that they have, maybe anger, maybe frustration, maybe joy at times. All of those things are explored in their complexity, and you know that's the value of having that kind of framework.
I think also the skill that has been necessary to develop is learning to listen, and not just to listen always to what's said, but to hear what is underneath what is said, because we can't express something unless we hear what it is. And people have a lot of ways of communicating that. And so it has been necessary. I think a lot of those skills we've developed over time, and again, learnt a lot from the activists we've worked with, but listening, negotiating. You know, I also did training in conflict management because that has been, when you're working with people with different views and you work with a lot of people at the same time, then actually having those skills, because in fact conflict can be negative, but in fact what happens is when people have different opinions and they come together, if you're able to do that in a way that where there is a safe space that they can come together, what you get is something really new. People always talk about innovation. That's how innovation is created, through difference. So if you work with people who are the same as you get sameness. But therefore you need to know how to manage what happens when that difference comes together and hits up against each other. And so the safe space, which you learn about in conflict management training, can be created through an art process and an artwork. And so that is a means through which a lot of these collective projects have been able to come together.
And that process is also, known as a dialectical process, because it's the, thesis, antithesis, and then the resolution. So that I suppose, and that brings me on to just say something about the influences of theory, that at the time as well, a lot of the French structuralist and post-structuralist stuff was being translated into English. So people like, Roland Barthes and later on people like Foucault, etc. Those kinds of analysis, semiology, all that stuff was beginning to come into the domain as well. So, the reading the theory as well as the practice was always very much part and parcel of the process, and therefore writing about it as well. That's one of the reasons we used to write about the stuff as well, is that idea of keeping the debates in the art world. So the debates are theoretical as well as showing the work.
Yeah, and also I think another reason for the writing was that because we were working in a way that was different to the way most artists were practicing, we believed very strongly, and still do, that what we were doing is art. It's not something else. And there were attempts all the time to marginalise the sort of work that we and others were doing. It was called education, it was called social work. We knew it was art. We also knew that this was a moment when art needed to move in this direction. We felt that very strongly for a number of reasons. And so it was important to keep reinstating how this was as art. Because if you imagine, we weren't being shown in galleries very much. The work wasn't designed for galleries. It was sometimes documentation was shown, for example, in the Art for Whom exhibition, where the Bethnal Green work was shown. And there's nothing wrong with it being shown in that way, but the work wasn't designed for galleries, and therefore it wasn't visible, and it still isn't. A lot of artists who are working this way even now find it difficult to find out what's going on in this field. And so I think galleries do have a role, really, for showing what's going on. But we also needed to work very hard at establishing the fact that this was important as art, a development in art that needed to be listened to and would develop. And of course it has, many decades later. Now there are many people writing about this sort of work. But at the time...
Yeah, we called it transitional practice, didn't we? Because what we wanted to do is to try and develop a practice which was not based in the art market. Because the art market was a development of capitalism, and we were thinking, well, what kind of practice would be one which is moving out of that into something which was more socially based. So we were kind of inventing the infrastructure as well as the work itself. And the infrastructure were these committees, the development of the groups that we worked with, and the means of production, and the means of distribution and exchange, which was, the writing was part of that. So it's trying to hold all those balls in the air at the same time, wasn't it, really? Woody Guthrie had written on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." Now, of course, he didn't mean that he hit people over the head with his guitar. But what he was talking about was the power of culture to mobilize people, to get people to think differently. And his songs at the time in the 30s were all about getting people to think differently, you know, post the 30s crash. And I've spoken about Ken Saro-Wiwa's statement as well. So the importance of culture, therefore, in changing ideas, getting people to think differently, is crucially important. And one of the things that we've always tried to do, I suppose, is, well, working on different levels. So you start off with working with the group who are the immediate participants. So you're working with them to create the work. So they're the first kind of sphere of discourse, if you like, that's about changing perception. And that includes our own, because we're all in a learning curve together in these processes. And then the next sphere outside of that is people who then may see the work who've not been involved in it. So they may see the posters, etc. And one hopes that the work done in the first phase is done well enough that it creates a resonance with the people who are then looking at it, to draw them in through the use of image and text, but also harnessing that passion that we talked about earlier. So that's the second level. And then there's a third level of people who may see the documentation, and it may be in magazines or wherever, that's written with articles, etc. And that's another level removed, but one hopes through entering into that with the writing, with describing the work, and with getting the work out there, that's another level in which the debate takes place. You know, there's no question in my mind that you know, culture has an important role to play.
I feel very privileged to be able to be at a moment where it's possible to pass on some of that knowledge gained from the earlier times to the younger generation, because this is the time we can do it. You know, another 10 or 20 years we might be gaga, and so really this is the moment to pass on the lessons. And in fact, I went to one event. It was a series of workshops where people from my generation were passing on a whole range of different skills in how to organise, how to do all sorts of things that you need to know if you're going to be effective as an activist. And so I'm delighted to see what's happening at the moment.